The morning it happened, Corbin was late because of a rooster. Not a metaphor, an actual rooster. The bird belonged to his neighbor Earl, a 73-year-old widower, who let his 6 chickens roam the property line like they owned the deed, and that Tuesday, the rooster had somehow gotten through the gap in the fence and was standing in the middle of Corbin's driveway, refusing to move. Corbin spent 11 minutes coaxing the thing back through the gap, with a piece of bread crust and a broom handle before he could back his truck out. 11 minutes. That was all it took for his entire life to shift direction. He was driving the old Chevy, the 74 stepside he'd been restoring since his father passed, a project that had no deadline and no real point, except that it gave his hands something to do on the evenings his daughter was at her grandmother's. The truck ran fine, but it looked like something a person had dragged out of a creek bed. Oxidized green paint, a cracked passenger mirror held in place with electrical tape, rust blooming along the rear wheel wells like orange flowers. He never drove it into town usually, but his Silverado was in the shop, and he had a meeting at the county assessor's office at 9, and so there he was, on Route 7 heading into Millhaven, in a truck that had no business being on the same road as anything built after 1985. He was coming through the light at Chandler and Foss when the black SUV ran the stop sign. It wasn't a question of fault. There was a stop sign. She didn't stop. The front quarter panel of the Range Rover caught the rear corner of the Chevy hard enough to spin the truck's back end to the gravel shoulder. And for one long second, Corbin thought the whole thing was going to roll. It didn't. He sat there gripping the wheel, engine still running, listening to the tick of something that was probably fine and probably wasn't. Then he got out. She was already out of the SUV by the time his boots hit the gravel. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled into something that looked deliberate, wearing a cream blazer over a silk blouse. At 8:40 in the morning, like she had somewhere important to be, she was staring at her front bumper, which had a crack in the lower fascia, maybe 4 inches. With her hand pressed flat against it, assessing. "Your rear panel swung into my lane," she said. She didn't look up. Corbin looked at the stop sign 6 feet from where her vehicle was now parked. He looked at the skid marks in the gravel that told the whole story in a single sentence. He looked at the damage to the Chevy, which was not 4 inches of cracked plastic but an entire rear quarter panel bent. Inward, the taillight shattered. The bumper torqued sideways off its mounts. "There's a stop sign," he said. "I saw it." She was still looking at her bumper. "I had nearly cleared the intersection. That's not how stop signs work." She looked up then. She had the kind of eyes that were used to being listened to, not unkind exactly, but accustomed to a room adjusting to her rather than the other way around. She glanced at the Chevy the way a person might look at a piece of furniture they weren't sure was worth moving around. "We should exchange information," she said. "My insurer will sort it out. I need to make a call." She turned and walked back toward the driver's side, already pulling out her phone. Corbin stood there in the gravel and breathed through his nose. He was a man who had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the moments when you most wanted to say the wrong thing were the moments that most required you to say nothing at all. He waited. She made her call. 3 minutes, maybe 4. When she came back, she had a business card between 2 fingers, held out to him like he was a valet. He took it. Vaughn Whitmore. She was VP of something at a company called Altercroft Group. The card was heavy stock, the kind that costs more per box than most people spend on groceries. "My assistant will handle the claim," she said. "I have a meeting." "So do I." She paused, just briefly. "Then we're both in agreement this can be handled remotely." "I haven't agreed to anything," Corbin said. "You ran a stop sign. That truck's been in my family for 50 years. I'd like a police report." Something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly, more like recalibrating. "That will take at least an hour. Probably." She looked at him for a moment, and he had the sense she was deciding something. Not about the accident. About him. She was trying to figure out what kind of person stood in a gravel shoulder in work boots, driving a truck held together by electrical tape and stubbornness, and refused the easy exit. "Fine," she said. And she called the non-emergency line herself, which he hadn't expected. They waited on opposite sides of the shoulder. She answered emails on her phone. He leaned against the Chevy's good side and watched a red-tailed hawk work the tree line beyond the guardrail, riding a thermal so lazy and unhurried it was almost insulting. He had a folder in the cab. It had been there for 11 months. He'd told himself he was waiting for the right time. He'd told himself he was waiting until things settled. He'd told himself a lot of things that were easier than admitting he was afraid of what delivering it might start. The folder had belonged to a man named Walter Whitmore. Walter had been Corbin's closest friend for 6 years, which was strange, given that Walter was 68 and Corbin was 39 when they met, and their friendship had started in the waiting room of an oncology clinic. Corbin's wife, Prue, was in treatment. Walter's wife was in treatment. They had sat next to each other for 3 Tuesdays in a row before either of them said more than a nod. The 4th Tuesday, Walter brought a thermos of coffee and 2 cups and set one on the chair next to Corbin without asking, and that was apparently that. Prue didn't make it. Walter's wife, Helen, made it to remission, then to recovery, then to 3 more years before a separate illness took her anyway. Walter had told Corbin once that life was less interested in fairness than people liked to believe, but that wasn't a reason to stop paying attention. Walter died 14 months ago. He had a daughter. She ran the company he'd built from a regional logistics firm into something Corbin vaguely understood was now a sizable operation with offices in 4 states. Her name was on the business card Corbin was holding. He looked at it. He looked at her 40 feet away, composing an email with both thumbs. He could not tell, looking at her, whether she knew what her company had done. The officer came, took statements, issued the report. Vaughn was civil to the officer in a practiced way, polite without warmth, efficient. She and Corbin exchanged information. She photographed both vehicles. Before she got back in the SUV, she glanced at him once more. "The claim should process within a week," she said. "There's something I need to tell you," Corbin said. She stopped. He hadn't planned to say it then. He'd planned to think about it more, to figure out the right approach, to maybe consult someone. But the folder was in the truck and she was standing 3 feet away, and he'd been carrying this for 11 months, and some things had their own weight and their own timing, regardless of what you planned. "Your father and I were friends," he said, "for 6 years. He passed last year." She went very still. "I know," she said. "I was there. He gave me something. Before the end, he asked me to give it to you when the time was right." He paused. "I've been working up to that." She stared at him. The recalibrating look was back, but different now. Less certain, more exposed. "Who are you?" "Corbin Hale. I'm a structural engineer. I do restoration work part-time. Your father hired me 4 years ago to assess the old warehouse property in Millhaven that your company owns." He held her gaze. "We ended up talking for about 3 hours that first day. After that, we just kept talking." Vaughn said nothing. "The folder's in my truck," Corbin said. "I'm not trying to make your morning harder than it already is, but I've been holding on to it for 11 months and I think I've been holding on to it too long." She didn't take it that morning. She said she had to get to her meeting. He understood. He had his own to get to, but she didn't drive away with the same energy she'd arrived with, and when she pulled back onto Route 7, he went slower than he expected. He sat in the Chevy for a while after she left. The hawk was gone. The gravel had settled. Whatever this morning was going to be, it had already become something else. His daughter, Marin, was 7. She had her mother's mouth and her grandfather's stubbornness, and an opinion about everything, which Corbin found equal parts exhausting and sustaining depending on the hour. She stayed with his mother Tuesday nights so Corbin could get an early start Wednesday mornings, and she called him every night at 8, regardless, to tell him one important thing she had noticed that day. That Wednesday night, the important thing she had noticed was that her classroom fish had been looking at her specifically. "Fish don't have great vision," Corbin said. "It probably looks at everyone that way." "It was me," Marin said with complete confidence. "I know because I moved to the side and it followed. Smart fish. His name is Copernicus." "Of course it is." He lay on the couch after the call, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the folder still sitting in the glove box where he'd moved it after the accident. Because he hadn't wanted to leave it in the open cab. He thought about Walter sitting in the oncology waiting room with 2 cups of coffee, not asking, just offering. He thought about the last conversation they'd had, 2 weeks before Walter died, when Walter had pressed the folder into his hands and said, "When she's ready to hear it." Not before. The question Corbin had been living with for 11 months was how to know when someone was ready to hear something they didn't know they needed to hear. He didn't have the answer. But he thought, maybe, that running into a person at a stop sign they'd blown through might be as clear a signal as he was likely to get. Vaughn called him 4 days later. He was on a job site measuring a load-bearing wall in a house in Gresham when his phone went. He stepped outside. "You said there was a folder," she said, without identifying herself, as if they were mid-conversation, which in some way they were. "Yes. What's in it?" "Letters. Documents. Your father could explain them better than I can, but he's not here, so I'll do my best." He paused. "Can we meet?" She was quiet for a moment. "I have time Friday morning. There's a coffee place on the east side of Millhaven, on Reed Avenue. 7:30, I'll be there." The coffee place was small and smelled like cardamom and old wood and serious intent. Vaughn was already there when he arrived, at a table in the back with her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. She'd dressed down from the day of the accident. Dark jeans, a gray sweater, and she looked, he thought, like a person who had spent 4 days deciding whether to make this phone call. He sat down. He put the folder on the table between them. She looked at it for a moment before she touched it. Inside were 7 letters in Walter's handwriting, a single-page document with a notary stamp, and a smaller sealed envelope with her name on it in blue ink. "He wrote these over about 18 months, Corbin said. "He told me he'd tried to talk to you directly, more than once. He said you were always moving too fast to land." Something moved across her face. Not offense, something closer to grief. "That's fair," she said quietly. "He wasn't criticizing you. I know." She touched the edge of the sealed envelope. "What does the notarized document say?" Corbin was quiet for a moment. "Your father sold a controlling interest in Aldercroft to a group of investors 8 years ago. He retained a significant minority share, and there were protections written into the agreement. Protections about how certain legacy assets were managed, including the Millhaven properties and several others he'd developed himself." He watched her. He believed those protections were violated. Vaughn's hand stilled. "He believed," Corbin continued, "that your company's current board made decisions about 2 of those properties that directly harmed people. A warehouse that was condemned and converted to short-term contractor housing. It was in a bad state. There was a fire." He saw the moment she understood what he was saying. 3 years ago, she said. "It wasn't a question, yes, the Dunmore Street fire." Her voice had gone very flat. 11 people were displaced. 2 were hospitalized. Your father had documentation suggesting the safety violations were reported internally and ignored. He tried to address it through the board. He was told it was being handled. Corbin stopped. He didn't believe it was being handled. Vaughn put her coffee cup down. The table was quiet between them. "He never told me," she said. "He thought, and I'm quoting him, that you had inherited his talent for building things and his instinct for trust, which meant you extended it too generously to the people around you." Corbin said it as carefully as he could. "He wasn't accusing you. He was afraid that if you learned about it the wrong way, you'd carry guilt for it that wasn't yours to carry. He wanted you to have the documents first so you could see it clearly." She was looking out the window at the street. Her jaw was tight. "He was trying to protect me," she said. "Yes." Which was his other quality, she said. He was always trying to protect people from the thing that was coming instead of preparing them for it. She didn't say it with bitterness. She said it like a person describing something they'd understood for a long time but had never quite said aloud. She read the letters that afternoon, alone, in her car, in the parking structure where she worked. She knew she couldn't read them at her desk, because there were things she needed her face to do privately, and it seemed important to be still and enclosed when she did it. Walter's handwriting was large, and slightly tilted to the right, the way it always had been since she was small. When he used to leave notes in her lunch bag, during the 1 year they were briefly in the same school building, the year she was in 4th grade and his law office was 2 blocks from the school. She hadn't thought about that in years. The first letter was almost practical. Dates, names, a rough chronology of when he first noticed the discrepancies in the board reports. The second was harder. He wrote about sitting in the attorney's office and being told that his documentation was insufficient, that the fire had been investigated and resolved, that the settlement with the displaced residents had been paid. He wrote, "I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them. I think I told myself that the payment meant accountability. It didn't. Payment and accountability are not the same thing, and I knew that before I let myself pretend otherwise, and that's the part I'm most ashamed of." The third letter was about Corbin, which surprised her. "I want to tell you how I met him," Walter had written. "We were both in a waiting room hoping for something we weren't going to get. That's a particular kind of place, a room like that. Everybody in it is wearing their real face." Corbin was 39 and already had the look of a man who had learned not to expect too much from the next hour, which I recognized because I had learned the same thing by the time I was 35. He is a fundamentally decent person. I don't mean that as faint praise. I mean that he has chosen decency consistently in situations where the decent choice cost him something, and that's the only kind of decency that counts. He is also the only person outside my family who came to Helen's service and didn't feel like an obligation. He came because he wanted to. He stood at the back and he didn't make a speech. That mattered more than I can say. She sat for a long time after she finished the last letter, her hands in her lap, the folder closed on the passenger seat. She thought about the morning of the accident. She thought about the way she'd held out her business card. She thought about how she'd looked at his truck. She was not, she knew, a person who thought poorly of people who had less than she did. She didn't believe that, but she also knew there was a distance between what you believed about yourself and how you behaved in the first 30 seconds of a stressful moment, and that distance was where character actually lived. She had not behaved well. She opened her phone and found his number. She called on a Thursday evening and said, "I've read them." "Okay," Corbin said. "I need to understand more about the documentation. There are references to internal communications I don't have. I think I know where they might be. Tell me what you need. I need to know if this rises to the level of something that requires external reporting. I have a relationship with a regulatory attorney. But I need to know if your father, if Walter, ever discussed what he wanted done with this, beyond giving it to you to give to me." Corbin was quiet for a moment. He walked out onto his porch, leaving the door half open behind him. The evening was cool and smelled like rain was thinking about coming. "He said he didn't want it buried," Corbin said. "He said he'd spent enough time watching the burial happen from the inside and he was tired of it. He said whatever you decided to do with it, you should do it without letting anyone tell you that protecting the company was the same as protecting what he built." He paused. "I think he trusted you to know the difference." She didn't say anything for a moment. "He had more faith in me than was probably warranted," she said. "I'm not sure about that," Corbin said. The next several weeks were not simple. Vaughn spent 2 weeks quietly retrieving communications from archived servers she still had access to as a minority shareholder. She engaged the regulatory attorney without telling anyone on the board. She met twice with one of the families displaced by the Dunmore Street fire. A meeting that cost her more than anything else in the process, because the family was not an abstraction and had never been, and she had to sit across from them and hold that. She called Corbin on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of it. Not about the documents, she just called. "How did you do it?" She said, "After your wife, how did you keep?" She stopped. "How did you keep doing the next thing?" He thought about it honestly, the way Walter had always made him feel he could. "At first I just did it for Marin," he said. "She was 4. She needed breakfast and somebody to take her to the park, and somebody to read to her at night, and so I did those things. And then somewhere in the middle of doing those things, I started doing them a little bit for myself again too." He paused. "It came back in very small pieces. I'm not sure I could have handled it coming back all at once." "She sounds like a good reason," Vaughn said. "She's a spectacular reason." She was quiet for a moment. "My father talked about her?" "In the letters, he mentioned Marin. He met her twice. She informed him, both times, that he was holding his coffee cup wrong." Vaughn made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's Walter. I thought so too," Corbin said. "She met Marin on a Saturday in October, which was not planned but happened anyway, because Corbin needed to drop off a signed document at a coffee shop and Marin was with him, and there was no polite way to arrange it differently. Marin evaluated Vaughn in the quiet, total way she evaluated everyone, not rudely, just with a completeness of attention that children hadn't yet learned to disguise. "Your hair is very long," Marin said. "It is," Vaughn agreed. "Mine's medium," Marin said. "I'm growing it to donate, but it takes so long. Did you know it takes like a year just for a few inches?" "I didn't know that. It's a lot of waiting." Marin accepted a piece of the muffin Corbin had ordered for her. "But that's okay. Good things take a long time. My dad said that." Vaughn looked at Corbin, who was looking at the table with the specific expression of a parent who recognized their own words being used back at them. "Your dad's right," Vaughn said. "He's usually right," Marin said, with the magnanimity of someone granting a significant concession. The formal filing happened in November. The board was informed. There were conversations that were not comfortable, and one that was a great deal worse than uncomfortable, and at the end of it a compliance review was opened by the state, and 2 board members resigned before it concluded. The settlement with the Dunmore Street families was renegotiated and increased. That wasn't justice, exactly. Vaughn knew that, but it was something real moving in a real direction, and Walter had always told her that you couldn't wait for the perfect solution before you moved, because waiting for perfect was another way of choosing nothing. She thought about him a lot in those weeks. She thought about how long he'd been carrying it. She thought about him sitting in a waiting room next to a man who would turn out to be the person he trusted with the thing he couldn't carry alone anymore. And she thought about the specific mercy of finding the right person in the right waiting room, which was not a thing you could plan. She went to the cemetery on a Wednesday in December, when the first snow had come and gone, and left everything looking specific and clean. She stood at his grave for a while. She didn't have anything particular to say, she just wanted him to know she'd read it. She wanted him to know she'd gone to see the family. She wanted him to know she'd tried. She thought he probably knew. Corbin was in the middle of refinishing the Chevy's passenger door, which had been dented since 1987 according to family lore, when she texted him a photo of the cemetery. No caption, just the photo. He looked at it for a long time, sitting on a low stool in his garage with the smell of primer around him and a sanding block in one hand. He texted back, "He'd be proud of you." She replied after a minute, "I think he'd tell me I took too long." Corbin wrote, "Probably, but he'd say it with coffee." She came for dinner in January, which started as a simple thing and turned into Marin teaching her 4 consecutive games of Uno with evolving house rules that Vaughn suspected Marin was inventing in real time, but chose not to challenge. At some point, Marin fell asleep on the couch under a fleece blanket, still holding her cards, and Corbin covered her, and he and Vaughn sat at the kitchen table with the remainder of the wine and the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had arrived at something by an unlikely route. "I thought about the morning of the accident," Vaughn said. "The way She stopped. "I wasn't kind." "You were in a hurry and caught off guard," Corbin said. "I've been unkind in moments that I'd had plenty of time to prepare for." Still, he agreed. "But you stayed for the police report. Under protest." "You stayed," he said again, like that was the actual point. She looked at the window, which was dark outside and reflecting the warm kitchen light back at them. "He knew," she said, "that we'd meet. He knew you had the folder and he knew you drove that truck and he must have known eventually we'd." She shook her head. "That's a very long game to play." "He was a patient man," Corbin said. "He was a stubborn man," Vaughn said, "who had learned to disguise it as patience." Corbin thought about the thermos of coffee and the 2 cups, placed without asking, in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and dread. "He was both," he said. "I think that's probably how it works." From the couch, Marin made a small sound in her sleep, resettled and pulled the blanket tighter with her fist. Outside, the January dark was very still. Vaughn didn't leave until almost 10, and when she did, she stood at the door for a moment in her coat, looking back at the warm kitchen and the child asleep on the couch and the man standing in the doorway who had held her father's last gift for 11 months and driven a broken truck to the right intersection on the right morning and waited. "Thank you," she said, "for not burying it." "Thank you," Corbin said, "for being ready when it mattered." She walked out into the cold, and above the bare trees the sky was full of stars that had been there all along, patient and indifferent and beautiful, waiting for someone to look up.